The first thing that broke him was not the cracked mirror in the hotel corridor or the borrowed suit clinging too tightly to his shoulders, but the words that floated through the quiet hallway like a confession never meant to be overheard, words spoken softly into a phone by a woman everyone else had already learned to overlook. He had checked into his own luxury hotel under a false name, pretending to be just another tired traveler, expecting boredom, anonymity, and a few nights of silence, yet in that narrow corridor he felt something split open inside him as the new janitor paused with her cart, pressed a gloved hand to her chest, and spoke with a trembling honesty that money had never taught him how to hear. Before the story unfolds any further, take a moment right now and like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel, Acts That Matter, if you believe in kindness, second chances, and the quiet miracles that happen when people choose compassion over judgment. The man had built his empire on numbers, acquisitions, and cold decisions that never asked him to look into another person's eyes for too long. He was known in boardrooms as a genius and in business magazines as untouchable, but after a bitter divorce and the sudden death of his father, his penthouse felt like a museum of empty victories. On a reckless impulse born from exhaustion, he decided to stay for a week in one of his own hotels without anyone knowing who he was, craving the strange comfort of being unseen. He checked in late at night, carrying his own bag, listening to the polite indifference of staff who had no idea the men standing before them signed their paychecks. For the first time in years, he felt oddly lighter, as if removing his name had removed a burden he no longer knew how to carry. The hotel itself was a cathedral of quiet luxury, polished floors reflecting warm lights, hallways scented faintly with citrus and linen. Early one morning, unable to sleep, he walked the corridors while most guests still dreamed behind closed doors. That was when he noticed the janitor, knew by the look of her hesitant movements, pushing her cart with careful respect as though every surface mattered deeply to her. She wore a plain uniform slightly too big for her dark hair pulled into a tight bun, her expression focused yet heavy with thoughts she carried alone. She stopped near the window at the end of the corridor, unaware that anyone stood behind her, and answered a phone call that clearly carried the weight of her world. He did not intend to listen, but her voice held him in place. It was low, strained, and full of tenderness that did not belong to someone who had so little power in life. She spoke about a child who needed medicine, about a promise she would keep no matter how tired she felt, about how this job, no matter how small it seemed to others, was her chance to hold her family together. She apologized again and again to the unseen person on the other end of the line, not for failing, but for not being able to give more, for needing time, for believing that tomorrow might be kinder than today. There was no bitterness in her tone, only resolve shaped by quiet suffering. The millionaire stood frozen, his heart pounding in a way it had not during billion-dollar deals. He had spent years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, people who praised him loudly while fearing him silently. Yet here was a woman with nothing, offering everything she had to someone she loved, asking for no applause, no recognition. When she ended the call, she wiped her eyes quickly, straightened her shoulders, and returned to her work as if tears were just another mess to clean up before the day officially began. He returned to his room shaken, unable to focus on the emails waiting on his phone. That morning planted a seed of restlessness that grew with each passing day. He began paying closer attention to the invisible lives moving around him. He noticed how the janitor arrived earlier than everyone else and left later, how she treated each room with care as though it belonged to someone she respected deeply. He noticed how supervisors barely acknowledged her presence, how guests walked past without a glance, how her kindness existed quietly, without witnesses. As days passed, he learned fragments of her story without ever speaking directly to her. He overheard staff discussing her background in hushed tones, how she had recently arrived in the city after leaving an abusive marriage, how she was raising a young son alone while caring for an ill mother. Each detail pressed against his conscience, challenging the comfortable narrative he had built about success being a simple reward for hard work. He had always believed the world was fair enough, that effort eventually paid off, but this woman worked harder than most people he knew and still carried a weight that seemed unbearable. The man found himself thinking back to his own beginnings, the early days when his father ran a small repair shop and taught him the value of persistence. Somewhere along the way, ambition had hardened him, teaching him to see people as roles instead of souls. Watching the janitor reminded him of his mother, who once worked 2 jobs without complaint, whose quiet strength had been the foundation of his confidence. He realized with a sharp pang of regret that he had not cried when she died, too busy negotiating contracts to sit with his grief. One afternoon, a minor crisis erupted in the hotel when a VIP guest complained loudly about a room not being cleaned to their standards. The janitor was blamed, even though the issue had been caused by a scheduling error beyond her control. He watched from a distance as she absorbed the criticism without defending herself, her eyes lowered, her hands clenched tightly in front of her. Something in him snapped then, not with anger, but with clarity. He saw how power could wound without even trying, how silence could become a weapon when those with authority chose convenience over truth. That evening, he returned to his room and stared at the city lights outside his window, realizing that pretending to be invisible had taught him more about himself in a few days than decades of success ever had. He understood that wealth had insulated him from pain, but also from purpose. The janitor's phone call echoed in his mind, not as a sound, but as a challenge, asking him who he wanted to be when no one was watching. The following morning, he made quiet inquiries, not revealing his identity, but asking careful questions that revealed the truth he already suspected. He learned how close the janitor was to losing her job because of one mistake she did not make, how her wages barely covered rent and medical bills, how she dreamed of returning to school one day but could not imagine when that would ever be possible. Each fact settled heavily in his chest, demanding action rather than sympathy. The change did not come in a dramatic announcement or a public display of generosity. Instead, it unfolded subtly, like light creeping into a dark room. Policies were reviewed, schedules adjusted, and a culture of respect began to take root almost invisibly. The janitor was offered additional training opportunities, fairer hours, and access to resources that had previously been reserved for others. She sensed the shift without understanding its source, feeling for the first time that her efforts were seen, that her struggle mattered. As for the man, revealing his true identity came quietly too, not with applause but with accountability. He met with staff, listened more than he spoke, and acknowledged the distance that had grown between leadership and humanity. The hotel changed, but more importantly, so did he. He no longer walked past people without seeing them. He no longer measured success solely in profit margins. The janitor, still unaware of the full impact of her words, continued to work with the same dignity she always had, but now with a growing sense of hope she could not fully explain. Months later, as he prepared to leave the hotel, no longer as a guest but as a man transformed, he passed the same corridor where it all began. The janitor was there again, sunlight catching the edges of her uniform, her posture lighter, her expression calmer. He did not stop her or thank her aloud. He understood that some gifts are not meant to be returned directly. Some moments exist simply to change us, quietly and forever. If this story is touching something inside you, if it reminds you of the unseen people whose strength keeps the world moving, please take a moment now to like, share, and subscribe to Acts That Matter, because stories like this only spread when hearts choose to carry them forward. Just before we end, we have one special request for you, and it truly matters. Please comment below with a single word or sentence about what kindness means to you, because your words might be the encouragement someone else needs today. The millionaire left the hotel that day with less certainty about the world but more faith in people. He had learned that humility could be found in unexpected places, that wisdom sometimes arrives wearing gloves and pushing a cart, and that the smallest, most private acts of love can echo louder than any fortune. And somewhere in that quiet city, a woman continued her journey, unaware that her whispered phone call had rewritten the life of a man who finally understood that wealth means nothing unless it lifts someone else along the way. The days that followed did not pass quietly inside the man's mind, even though the hotel itself remained calm and orderly. Every step he took through the polished corridors felt heavier, as if the building had revealed something it had long been hiding from him. He began to notice details he had ignored for years when he walked these same halls as an owner instead of a guest. The soft hum of cleaning machines before sunrise, the tired eyes of staff who smiled automatically, the way some people seemed to shrink as they moved, trying not to take up space. It unsettled him how easily he had once accepted this silence as efficiency, never questioning the cost paid by those who lived inside it. He started waking earlier, not out of discipline but restlessness. From his room window, he watched the city stretch awake, vendors setting up stalls, buses filling with workers clutching bags and hope in equal measure. It reminded him that most lives were built not on ambition alone, but endurance. The janitor was already working by the time he stepped into the hallway, her presence steady and constant, like part of the building's foundation. There was something grounding about her routine, the way she treated each task as meaningful, as if dignity itself lived in careful effort. Without intending to, he began timing his walk so he would pass through the areas she cleaned. He never spoke to her, never interrupted her work, yet her existence anchored his thoughts. He wondered how many people like her had passed through his properties over the years, carrying burdens he had never paused long enough to imagine. The realization stung, not because it accused him loudly, but because it whispered truthfully. He had believed himself fair, even generous, yet fairness without awareness suddenly felt hollow. As the week unfolded, small tensions within the hotel revealed themselves more clearly. Staff meetings were rushed, complaints were handled mechanically, and decisions flowed downward without context or compassion. He saw how fear disguised itself as professionalism, how people avoided responsibility not from laziness but from the quiet understanding that mistakes were punished, not corrected. This was not the environment he thought he had built. Somewhere along the way, growth had replaced care, and systems had replaced people. One evening, while sitting alone in the hotel lounge, he overheard fragments of conversation from nearby staff members discussing overtime, childcare problems, and medical expenses spoken about in low voices meant to remain unheard. None of these struggles were dramatic enough to demand attention, yet together they formed a portrait of exhaustion that disturbed him deeply. He realized then that the janitor's phone call had not been an isolated moment of hardship, but a single thread in a much larger, invisible fabric of survival. That night, memories surfaced uninvited. He remembered his father coming home late, hands cracked and stained with grease, collapsing into a chair without complaint. He remembered his mother counting bills at the kitchen table, her face tight with worry until she noticed him watching and forced a smile. Those memories had once fueled his ambition, but success had slowly rewritten them into a story where struggle was only temporary, something people escaped if they worked hard enough. Now he understood how incomplete that story was, how cruel it could sound to those still trapped inside it. The janitor became a symbol of this awakening, though she never knew it. He watched how she helped an elderly guest without being asked, how she fixed a broken handle instead of reporting it, how she thanked coworkers even when they barely acknowledged her. There was no performance in her kindness, no expectation of reward. It was simply who she was. That authenticity unsettled him more than anger ever could, because it exposed the gap between who he claimed to be and who he had allowed himself to become. Something shifted inside him during those quiet observations. He stopped seeing the hotel as a business alone and began seeing it as a living organism, one sustained by people whose names he did not know but whose lives mattered deeply. The numbers on his report suddenly felt incomplete, incapable of capturing what truly kept the place running. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of responsibility that went beyond ownership, a responsibility rooted in humanity rather than control. By the end of the week, he knew this experience could not end the way he had planned. He had come seeking anonymity and rest, but he was leaving with purpose and discomfort intertwined. The janitor's whispered phone call had opened a door he could not close, forcing him to confront the truth that real wealth is measured not by what one accumulates, but by what one chooses to see. And as he packed his bag, preparing to step back into his powerful identity, he understood that Chapter 1 of his life had been about building success, but Chapter 2 would demand something far more difficult, learning how to deserve it.